is our third Lunch and Learn in our summer Lunch and Learn series. If you haven't signed our sign-in sheet, if you could do that, that'd be great. And just as a reminder, we are putting this on Facebook Live, so if you want to watch it again, you can certainly do that. Without further ado, let's get started with today's speaker, Dr. Timothy Parsons. He is a cultural resource management professional and archaeologist who has worked in the field since 2003. He completed his PhD and MA in anthropology at Florida State University and received an undergraduate degree in sociology and anthropology at Millsaps College. Dr. Parsons is a registered professional archaeologist and a member of the Society for American Archaeology and the Southeastern Archaeological Conference, and serves on the board of directors for the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers, and also the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation as an ex officio member, so thank you for that. Before his appointment as Division Director and State Historic Preservation Officer, he served as the Division's Deputy SHPO and Supervisor of Federal and State Compliance and Review. Prior to joining the Division, he spent 6 years with the National Park Service Southeast Archaeological Center and previously worked as the Cultural and Historical Programs Manager for the Blue Ridge Center for Environmental Stewardship in Northern Virginia. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Watch that kid.
Here we go, we got it.
We'll try not to trip over it. So am I in the right spot?
Yes, sir.
Is this good for all the millions of people out on Facebook? So I'm Tim. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here today. I have a cheat sheet. I'm sorry, my memory isn't as good as it used to be. So bear with me. But the real question that I have to ask is, do you like leisure? And do you like fun in the sun and the golden kiss of the tropical splendor of Florida upon you, maybe in your twilight years? Well, in that case, I have a great deal for you, because for only a few $1,000s, $30 down and $30 a month at a low bargain basement interest rate of about 6.5%, the dream can be yours. And so I would love to tell you about, excuse me while I duck, the Gulf American Land Corporation and Golden Gate Estates. And maybe you've heard stories in the past about unscrupulous Florida businessmen flying gullible Midwesterners over the state's southern swamps, promising them paradise and delivering on a swamp. Well, I am telling you today that not only are those stories true, but the human and environmental consequences of the great land scams of the 1960s and 1970s are still playing out and have consequences in and for Florida today. And we're going to spend a little bit of time learning about it, and you're just going to have to put up with me, so I'm sorry. So has anybody here been to Cape Coral? Surely someone has, so a few people. Okay. Well, that's where the Gulf American Land Corporation started in Florida, and they developed a great deal of that city right out of mangrove wetlands. You can't really do this anymore, and you wouldn't believe it, but there used to be a whole lot of mangroves right around Cape Coral, where they came in, took them all out, built it up between 1948 and 1952. I'm sorry, I think it was 68 and 62 actually. And they called it their partnership with Florida, tearing down all the natural mangroves and building a suburb. So that sounds about right. It was a glimpse of what was to come down near Naples on a much larger scale. And so tell me, who wouldn't want to live in the glorious Charlestown, which is a charming mid-century modern ranch-style home with all the modern amenities that the 50s and 60s can provide? Well, this is kind of what they were promising. And it looks pretty good today. And in the 1950s, it definitely looked really good. Nice one-car garage, big yard, a lamp post. Doesn't live in the dream. That's right. Well, it's all about location. Location. And Gulf American bought fast, they prepared fast, they sold fast, and they built fast. And this is Redfish Point near Cape Coral, for those of you all who know where that is, during the late 1950s and early 60s. And then this over here is how it looks today. So you can basically see all of this that used to be bordered by mangroves and was basically lowlands, was canalized, and boom, you have thousands and thousands and thousands of houses where there used to be wetlands and Gulf of Mexico. And the only thing protecting these homes from hurricanes is the Gulf of Mexico, which is a really bad idea. Of course, back in the 50s and 60s, they weren't necessarily thinking about that. What they were thinking about was, how do we sell this land, how do we build on it, and how do we make a whole lot of money? And they did all of that, but what they did in the process was create a big red target for storms and for other issues that we're dealing with today in 2018, like climate change and sea level rise. these two dashing gentlemen are the brains behind Cape Coral and Golden Gate Estates. And remember the names Julius Jack Rosen and his brother Leonard. And what they promised was the buffer between what people come to Florida for today and what early settlers came to Florida for over a century ago. So Leonard and Jack began their business careers not as southern real estate magnates, but as street vendors in Baltimore. And if you've ever been to Baltimore, you've seen the street vendors, and I guess there's nowhere to go but up, right? So they used the earnings of all their original businesses and a series of high-interest loans, because even back then, people hadn't learned their lesson, to set up a real estate company that became Gulf American. They made their first Florida land purchase in 1957. That was about 103 square miles of mangroves that became Cape Coral for $678,000. 103 square miles of land in Florida for a little over $500,000. Just a few years later, by the early 60s, the Rosens were looking further south for additional opportunities. Hi, Facebook. I'm gonna get a sip of coffee. So there we go. One thing about the Florida Trust is you can always count on having really good coffee.
Isn't that
It's
right?
kind of like if you've seen Twin Peaks when the FBI guy goes into the diner. It's like, oh, that's a damn good cup of Joe. I lost track of where I'm at. All right. So in fact, by 1966, Gulf American Land Corporation was the fourth largest traded public company in Florida. And they capitalized on their growth and their success in Coral Gables to sell bigger and sell better. So what this is saying, this is an article from the Chicago Tribune. Remember, Midwestern, who are they targeting? They're certainly not trying to sell swampland in Florida to people that live in Florida and know what's really there. So this is a series of facts up here about all the successes that they had in Cape Coral. And I think I said Coral Gables a few minutes ago, but I meant Cape Coral, obviously. And they basically say, Gulf American Corporation is great for people. We've hired this many people. We've developed this much. We're worth this much. Look at what we can do for you, Florida. And of course, people believed it, because why wouldn't they? They're extremely successful. They're making all this money. They're selling all these houses. Development in Florida at this time is a huge deal, because unlike today in 2018, where development is everywhere in Florida, and we have the huge cities of Miami, we have places like Jacksonville and Tampa and Orlando, for goodness sake. Remember, this is pre-Disney. The big tourist attraction in Florida at the time was probably like Silver Springs. So it was a very, very, very different time, and this was a very, very big deal. So Gulf American eventually purchased approximately 173,000 square miles of swampland in western Collier County, which is just east of Naples, so further down south, and began advertising land sales in the early 1960s, especially, again, to Northerners and Midwesterners in newspapers like the Chicago Tribune, and Indianapolis and other large Midwestern cities. They dubbed it Golden Gate Estates and professed that it was going to be the city of the future, with over 500,000 people, access to the Gulf of Mexico via a series of canals, and all the amenities of modern Florida life. And they set up offices in nearby major cities, of which there weren't many back then, and had reception centers at each end of the 173-mile subdivision. A 173-mile subdivision is what they had planned. Gulf American got so big that they purchased their own fleet of 5 Douglas DC-3s to fly prospective customers over the swamp to show them the choice lots of their land. Now, have y'all flown over the Everglades and looked down? Okay? You can fly over the Everglades, and for a whole lot of it, it's like, oh look, land. But no, it isn't. You see grass, and you see tree islands, and you don't realize that you're basically flying over a big, slow-moving river. And they use that bit of deception, to their advantage. Eventually, they were so successful that they ended up actually purchasing an airline based on the profits from their land sales. This is before they even really sold all that much down there, comparatively, when we're talking about over 100,000 acres. It was called Modern Air, and they facilitated these high-pressure sales pitch flights. So people would come from the north and the Midwest, get on these airplanes with salesmen mostly, we're talking about the 1960s, and they were fed steaks, they were given wine. It sounds like Mad Men, but you can't make it up. This actually happened. And by the end of the flight, sure, it sounds like a great idea to buy a nice patch of land down here in South Florida where we can retire in 20 or 25 years after we finish paying it off. And again, this is an article about that airline in the Chicago Tribune. So this is a plat map from the 1930s of western Collier County. And this is before development, obviously. And this is the township range and section map of part of the county back then. Right here in the center, this is called Big Cypress Swamp. Naples is over here. Wasn't a whole lot to Naples back then. So when we think of Big Cypress nowadays, we think of the Big Cypress Preserve, which is somewhere over here. Now, they didn't even plat all of this out where it says Big Cypress Swamp. Guess where Golden Gate Estates is? Guess where they're selling land? It is literally this land right there. Wasn't even fully platted out. That actually has implications later, too. Speaking of fraud, did I say fraud? So yeah, you were pretty much literally buying land by the gallon, is the joke that kind of came out of it. Oh yeah, I was supposed to push that button again on my clicker. There we go. So here's some 1940s and 50s aerial photos of Collier before development. Kind of standing in the way here. Now, as I said before, if you've flown over the Everglades, you might have been there many times and seen it, especially from the air. It looks beautiful, and if you squint, you think it'd be a good idea to build a subdivision there. But what people were actually buying was a pitch of hope and a promise. And buy now, said one ad. Yes, our down payment, and this is a quote, and monthly payment structure is set amazingly low so you can start today, in this very moment, to build up your investment portfolio towards a prosperous future for yourself, your family, your son or daughter's college education, toward the day you no longer have to work for money because your money is working for you. I did not make that up. That is a direct quote from an advertisement that ran in papers all over the country in the 1960s. So to make all this happen, Gulf American built not houses. What they actually built first were roads and canals, hundreds and hundreds of miles of them. So to avoid the appearance of selling swampland when they were flying people over, they built canals to drain the water, and they built 813 miles of roads before a single house was ever built in Golden Gate Estates. And 183 miles of canals. And then advertised Golden Gate Estates, and this is a technical real estate term, I guess, as, quote, semi-improved land. Now, that apparently didn't mean very much because there were no utilities, no public services, no sewer access, no water pipes, no fire protection, and the nearest police station was in Naples, which at the time, nowadays this is part of Naples. Back then this was not really part of Naples. If I'm moving around too much, Tonder,
no,
just let me know. I'm gonna get another cup of coffee. Drink a cup, here we go.
So there was no power? There was no infrastructure?
Great coffee. No, nothing. By the time they built these roads and canals, there was absolutely nothing. But again, they advertised and sold. And again, we'll go back to the Chicago Tribune, and it's hard to read, but again, this just espouses the beauty and wonder of buying houses in South Florida. Golf course, house, beautiful porch. When these ads were running initially, these houses weren't even built yet. Now, to give credit where credit is due, they did eventually start building houses. But it wasn't when they were initially selling them, obviously. Yeah?
Where did they take these stock photos from that they're using in their advertisements? Where is that house? Or is it?
Some of these are drawings, actually. A lot of the advertisements from the 1950s and 60s and 70s, rather than using photography,
Sure.
they actually would hire artists to draw it. So I made the joke about Mad Men earlier, but if you've seen the show Mad Men, what most of those people spent a lot of their time doing, who weren't the advertiser, or who weren't the execs who were out drinking 7 martini lunches, they were actually drawing and creating art. And these, as a matter of fact, none of these are photographs. I think,
All the way back here.
with the exception of that one, I think you can't really tell in the PowerPoint, but both of these are definitely, when I was hunting down advertisements for this talk, those are really clearly actually drawings and pieces of art. So who knows, they may have, who knows where the house came from. They may have had a posed picture or something like that they drew from. But in this case, they just drew pictures. So a lot of people did buy eventually. And in fact, over 40,000 people forked over portions of their monthly wages to the Rosens and Gulf American. And as you can see, well, here you go. This is what you're buying into, actually. I skipped a slide, but this is pretty much what it looked like from the air. And parts of it, this actually is a relatively recent, within the last few years, photo of part of Golden Gate Estates. So it didn't all actually grow out. So 40,000 people bought. And by 1984, which is when this photo was from, I believe, the northern half was pretty much built out to a certain extent, and it did receive electricity and other municipal services, but it wasn't filled by any stretch of the imagination, and it's hard to tell because of the sunlight, but in this northern part of Golden Gate Estates, this is I-75 right here, some of this is actually built out. And then by today, northern Golden Gate is mostly a working class, really huge neighborhood outside of Naples. In southern Golden Gate, which is down here, never received power, never received water, never received any kind of municipal infrastructure, and it had largely sort of returned to nature. And that's a high part of the story. I say return to nature. If you've seen movies like Blow and things like that, there were certain industries that took advantage of the relatively close proximity to large cities of Florida and the relative isolation and long, narrow stretches of dirt road. And a lot of airplanes landed here in the 1970s and 1980s from South and Central America. And there were people that lived out there too, but they did not have modern amenities, to say the very least. By the late 1960s, things pretty much started to fall apart for the Rosens. At one point, Gulf American rewrote legal descriptions. Remember how part of this land wasn't actually platted early on. They rewrote legal descriptions for over 1,000 lots, and they relocated them a few miles away. This is land that had already been sold after minerals were discovered in those sold parcels. And when that fraud was uncovered in 1967, it was the beginning of the end for the largest land scam in Florida history. And ironically, what brought down the company wasn't selling swampland at inflated prices to unsuspecting northerners. It was fraud related to rewriting legal descriptions and then a whole host of other questionable business practices. In 1974, the company filed for bankruptcy, promising eventually to provide phone service, electricity, and central sewer lines within 3 years. But in 1979, after failing to meet most of those promises, a federal court shifted the responsibility for making Golden Gate Estates a living community to, guess who? Well, pretty much. It's Collier County. Yeah. So this had long-term consequences. It had long-term consequences for the thousands of people who had purchased land in Golden Gate. And long after Gulf American went bankrupt and the company that eventually acquired them, Avatar Holdings, acquired that unsold land, individual landowners were busy finding ways to recoup their investment. But for the most part, they were never able to. And what this document actually says, if you could read it, this is a document that was put out by a landowners association at Golden Gate, where it basically says, we're giving up, there's no way that we can recoup any money, this is the end of the road for you, we've tried everything we can do, the original owners don't even, or the original development company isn't even around anymore. So if you were one of these people that bought land way out in the Florida swamp, you were pretty much out of luck. So eventually, and this is a 1987 article in the Miami Herald, Avatar began buying out landowners. And you wonder, well, why would they do that if there's no, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Well, they would quickly sell the land to consolidators at a profit, which only added insult to injury to all these individual landowners who for years and years sat on this investment with no return, couldn't build on it, couldn't sell it, couldn't do anything with it. And they were doing that because of the possibility of mineral rights and basically trying to sell consolidated bits of land to other people. Northern Golden Gate was essentially left as it was and continued to build out as taxpayers supported infrastructure development. So it went from the developers, as normally happens, helping support infrastructure development like sewer, water, gas, and so on, and electricity. The entire set of responsibilities related to building out infrastructure eventually shifted over to taxpayers. As of 2010, northern Golden Gate had a population of around 24,000 people, with about 7,000 homes built, a median household income of $42,295. Now remember what the Rosens promised back in the late 60s and early 70s was what? 500,000 people, hundreds of thousands of homes, and it was going to be, I mean, there's nothing wrong with $42,295, but that's not what they promised. They had promised a much kind of wealthier environment. That isn't what happened at all. Southern Golden Gate was another issue entirely. By the early 1990s, only 70 to 200 people lived on the 41,000 acres south of Interstate 75. Wet areas like this road, that's sort of a joke, but not really, it's a road, are supposed to be dry. And dry areas like this prairie up here are actually supposed to be wet if they had just been more or less left alone. So what you essentially had was a drained environmental disaster. Think parts of the Everglades after canals were put in, before Everglades restoration started back in the 1960s. That's essentially what you have. Southern Golden Gate is an area, and was an area then too, that is almost surrounded by other state and federal conservation land. And it's also, as I sort of mentioned a minute ago, it's critical for Everglades water flow. So in the early 1990s, the state of Florida determined to make some good out of this colossal real estate boondoggle by restoring the southern 41,000 acres to natural small bee origins. And over a couple of decades, there we go. The state worked to acquire land through several means, and now they're actually doing exactly that. So this is back in the time period. Now the state doesn't acquire a whole lot of land through the Florida Forever program. A little bit is funded sometimes every now and then. I don't think any Florida Forever legislative appropriations were made last year or the year before. But you can see through the 90s and into the 2000s, and especially under the Governor Bush administration, the state acquired thousands of acres of land between cabinet actions and gubernatorial authority. And by 2006, the acquisition, with the exception of a few inholdings, was essentially complete. So again, this went from a private investment strategy to the entire burden for the maintenance for this land and for doing something with this land being shifted over to Florida taxpayers. And over the next couple of decades, things sort of remain the status quo, but as of today, Southern Golden Gate is part of Picayune Strand State Forest. The roads have mostly been leveled, some of the canals have been filled or redirected, but part of the problem is once you create these canals, you can't just let them loose and let water go wherever you want it. If you were to do that in other parts of the Everglades, half of Miami would be underwater. Parts of Naples would be underwater. It's not a knot that you can just untie. And Picayune Strand State Forest and some of these canals are the same issue. Encroachment had occurred, especially from the west, and so you can't simply turn it all back over to nature, or all of that land and all of that development would then be underwater. Now there might be something to be said for that, but of course it's not a realistic strategy, at least at this point in time. And actually, one reason I included this photo, because this was included in a news article, you can see that they had power eventually to this part of Golden Gate Estates, but you can also see a generator sort of right down here, and according to the article that accompanied this, it was never hooked up to water or sewer. So you've got a house that looks like it was built in the 1990s for whatever reason, and it never received even the most basic of infrastructure support. So I don't recall what the rest of the story was behind that, but it's just, it's kind of baffling. So with some work, those dry fields and wet roads will eventually return to this kind of swamp and prairie, which is probably how it just should have stayed all those many years ago. But it's kind of turned into a cycle. And ironically, and it really is pretty ironic when you think about it, the biggest land scam in Florida history and one of the biggest proposed developments could eventually be responsible for one of the biggest environmental restoration projects, or be part of one of the biggest environmental restoration projects, not just in Florida, not just in the US, but in the entire world. So through Golden Gate Estates, we've gone from swamp to selling land at unreasonable prices to unsuspecting people, to unsustainable development, to abandonment, to restoration, and now sort of back to swamp and water. So with all of that said, can I sign y'all up for flights? But that's it. Thank you all very much. And if there are questions, I will try to answer them, but I will be honest and say I am not an expert in this subject. I had an interest in it a number of years ago, and I kind of cultivated that interest in the story. And then about 5 or 6 months ago, the Florida Museum of, not the Florida Museum of Natural History, the Museum of Florida History asked me to give a presentation on it because their director kind of knew about my interest. So I'm not an expert, I don't know all the details, but I'll do my best to answer questions. Yeah?
So I'm assuming this is beyond the statute of limitations, but I know DEP and all them are spending a fortune restoring the land. Can't they dig some of that money back from the Rosens, who are doing real well right now, I understand?
Well, one of the Rosens died shortly after
Maybe
retired.
their legacy or whatever.
Well, there were actually a number of lawsuits in the late 80s and early 90s. And by then, the Rosens were so far out of it and the responsibility had transferred to Avatar Holdings and then to other consolidators that there was no way to really hold Gulf American Land Corporation or the Rosens directly responsible because that company literally did not exist anymore. There were no assets, so there was no one to sue. And kind of ironically, in Cape Coral, just a couple of years ago, they had a big parade in honor of Rosen and Rosen's daughter because to Cape Coral, they're heroes. They created the city, notwithstanding, the impending threat of destruction through even a modestly sized hurricane. I guess what I'm trying to say is I've presented it as kind of like these guys were horrible vultures out to deceive and extract money from people, but that's not necessarily what everyone thinks. And so there was never this big push, or there was never enough momentum to, for example, try and get him thrown in jail or try and get an indictment against him for fraud or anything like that, because not everybody thought he was a bad guy. And on top of that, there were some settlements in the 80s and 90s from some of these other companies that accounted for some of the losses or at least reimbursed people for their property, but there was never a class action. And I don't know why that was, because I'm not an expert in real estate law, but nowadays something like this would happen, and there would be a class action lawsuit that would probably have some very high-priced, very talented lawyers behind it. At the time, Florida statute regarding real estate, as I understand it, wasn't structured that way. And so each of these homeowners or landowners was responsible for individually trying to get compensated for their losses. Now, of course, if you're you or me and you sue some big real estate company, we're probably not going to get very far. If there are 4,000 of us involved in a class action lawsuit, we have a better chance. So my assumption is, and I don't have the facts to back this up right now, is that no individual or no group of individuals had enough power to really hold people accountable for that level of fraud. Mm-hmm.
My understanding at that point in Florida, in the Florida legal structure, real estate wasn't a protectionable act under the class action legal direction, so that wasn't an option available to them at that time.
Yeah, same way that I understand it, and also as I understand it, because specifically, and these guys weren't the only guys doing this in Florida. There were others, not on this scale,
Right.
and because of a lot of these, I guess development projects, the laws in Florida were actually changed to prevent that kind of thing from happening in the future.
So do you think that they intentioned to deliver on the promises they made and the numbers just never kind of worked?
Actually, yeah, I do. I honestly don't think that the Rosens thought that they would end up really defrauding a lot of people. I don't think they had everybody's best intentions at heart. And this is just my personal, from reading a few books and that kind of thing. I think what happened, and some of the things I've read kind of indicate this, but what makes sense to me is when they started Golden Gate Estates in the 1960s, especially as they got later into the 1960s, this was a time period in kind of in legislative history and in social history where there was a lot of attention placed on sustainability, environmental concerns, You had laws passed like the National Historic Preservation Act, like the National Environmental Policy Act, like the Endangered Species Act, like the Department of Transportation Act, and all of those, to different extents, Clean Water Act too, I think, was 1960s, and all of those in different ways started placing restrictions and requiring permits for the kind of work that the Rosens were doing. And so, for example, when they said we're going to dig a canal to the Gulf of Mexico, I'm sure they meant to do that. But by the time they started work on these canals and started building it out, they couldn't do it because the Army Corps of Engineers wouldn't let them, or maybe the older version of Florida DEP wouldn't let them. They couldn't get certain kinds of permits. They would have to do certain studies under NEPA and so on. And so this kind of development would almost certainly never occur today at this scale because it would just be completely unfeasible in terms of the regulatory red tape and the environmental permitting and other kinds of permitting. Now that's probably a good thing, don't get me wrong, but back then there wasn't that concern. So they started going, and remember, they built out Cape Coral, but then by the time, time moved on, and even just a few years later, less than a decade later, the regulatory environment was different, and they just couldn't do it. Now, if none of those laws had been passed, it's entirely possible that Golden Gate Estates and that part of Collier County might actually look a lot more like Cape Coral. So,
So I'm trying to reenact this process. Say I'm a naive millionaire in New York City, sick of the winter, see Rosen's ad, and he's going to fly me for free over the cypress swamp, right? And I'm going to say, ooh, but he has to land his plane somewhere. Does he pick the only dry spot? And then, I mean, how can they not somehow, how can they hide the fact that, I know from the air it looks bad, but he has to land his plane somewhere, and I'm this millionaire, and wouldn't I twig on sooner or later that
Miami, Naples, and Tampa.
Huh?
Miami, Naples, and Tampa.
Oh, the plane landed in Miami, Naples, but you fly over the
That's
cypress
right.
swamp, but they don't land you. Right
Oh, no, absolutely not. No, they wouldn't land there.
God.
Oh, no. No, and that's why,
But
well, I'll tell you.
I would want to take a Jeep out to where my house was going to be built.
Well, remember, at the time, a lot of the people that were buying this, they weren't family, and they were looking to basically start their retirement planning, or a lot of folks, too, bought more than one parcel of land because eventually what they wanted to do, remember, this was supposed to be a whole community. There were going to be shops, schools, stores, all that kind of stuff. And so the idea was you buy enough of this land, and the money in the land will work for you. Eventually, you'll be able to sell it or rent it for more than you invested in it because somebody's going to want to build a store there, or somebody's going to want to put a parking lot there that's next to the mall. None of that really ever came to pass in that part of Collier County.
So they would assign the plot to you. I couldn't take an airboat to see which plot I wanted. Like I wanted the, this corner or that corner where closer to the store that they were going to build.
Well, in theory, that's how it worked. Maybe they did take some people out in airboats, but I doubt anybody would buy if they did.
Yeah, I know. That's what I'm trying to say. This naive millionaire in New York.
I don't think it was a whole lot of millionaires. I think they were just normal people like you or me. And again, they were looking to have their retirement dream or move their family down to beautiful sunny Florida. And
But you don't buy sight unseen.
Well,
they did.
Well, I think also and this is kind of phrases this question also, I think also in the time that this is happening in the 1960s, there was a culture of trust that existed within the economic community that doesn't exist today. So it's very easy for us to look in hindsight and be like, why would you ever do that?
Right.
But I think that especially for working middle class families, there's a culture of economic trust that existed for them because of their past experience that maybe we couldn't, we're looking at it 2020 and also in a culture where maybe we don't trust businesses the way that maybe we used to. But for them, I feel like there was no reason to feel like they were being gotcha'd because they were being sold something that they wanted, and that was a contract in that time and place that maybe hasn't stood the test of time. Would you agree with that?
I would agree. I mean, I don't think that anybody in this room in 2018 would, I'll buy something from Amazon or something, but I'm certainly not going to buy like a car unseen because one of my buddies says it's in great shape.
We have an expectation of transparency
Right.
in business that they didn't necessarily
Yeah.
have. So it's a sociological kind of phenomenon that existed as well as what you're saying from an anthropological standpoint.
Yeah, I
It's an
think
interesting thing to think about.
I don't think it would necessarily occur to people that they were being hoodwinked by. I mean, that's what those advertisements were about. Look how big and populous, or I'm sorry, look how big and successful, and huge in terms of money our company has become. Obviously, we can't be doing anything wrong, because if we were doing something wrong, somebody would have said something.
Well,
Why
there's
are we
other
this
places in
successful?
Florida that it worked.
Cape Coral.
Right, there was already
It wasn't an unknown model. That's right.
So I'm curious, would someone sign up just for the free flight to Florida?
I'm sure it happened all the time. You know?
And you would go to New York and fly down to Tampa and stay an extra week in Tampa or whatever.
Maybe. I don't know. I don't know all the
I mean,
specifics
sure.
of that. But yeah, why not?
Free summer vacation, but then you get hoodwinked.
Well, I mean, I remember when I was, this was in the 1980s, and I remember my parents getting, mail about timeshares and stuff, coming.
Smoky Mountains.
And honestly, timeshares aren't that much different. Timeshares are just a scam of a different kind. I think I would never do it. You can never get out of them. And
Just don't want 'em.
yeah, but I remember all the time where those things would come in the mail, and back when marketing calls were a thing before the internet, constantly get telemarketers calling about, are you interested in spending 2 weeks in sunny Daytona Beach every summer? Da 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 da. And it was just a thing. But I think it's a much different environment now. I think the regulatory environment's different. I think the sociological environment's definitely changed tremendously, probably in a lot of ways because of stuff like this. And I definitely don't think, remember, like in the post-Vietnam era, trust for government went completely downhill. And this was a time where, I think there was probably a little more trust in our public institutions than there is today. So that's probably another reason why this kind of thing happened.
Any other questions before we let Parsons leave? Any other questions?
All right, well, thanks very much.
Thank you.